Hi, my name is Bogey and I draw things, and in this video I will show you start to finish how I draw one page in my upcoming comic book, The Return of Detective Spencer. I draw traditionally, which means that I use paper, ink, color. Traditionally I don't use any software to design or draw. I use a little bit of Lightroom at the end for the scanned files, just to bring up some contrast or saturate the image more. But usually I just do paper, and I use this paper here. It's A3, even though the final result will be scaled down for print to A4. This is normal practice. Modern printer technology, or the screens that we use to look at this sort of content, have enough capacity to store more information per square inch, so it generally looks better, crispier. If you have a bigger image, then you scale it down. You wouldn't have that problem with digital, but in a traditional way you would generally draw on a bigger piece of paper, then you scale it down. This paper may not be the best choice for a comic book style inking, because for that you usually use something that's very glossy, so it's easier to apply the ink. It just spreads nicely, and it's easier also for you and for the tools that you traditionally use for inking. But since my final medium here is watercolor, I need a little bit of grain and a little bit of thickness to the paper. That's why this paper is what I go for. It has just a little bit of, you probably won't be able to see maybe at an angle, just a little bit of grain. And it's not even like the most professional watercolor paper, but those are pretty costly, and this is just good enough for my intentions and purposes. So let's start with the first part, which is the design phase. I will start from a small piece of paper where I will plan the page. I will do a thumbnail and kind of work around the ideas that I have for this page. Go on to the actual page, applying pencil sketch, then inking, and finally coloring. And the first thing in the process is I go to my script. Since it's a comic book that I'm writing, I am very loose with describing what happens. It's just some markers for me. Okay, on this page, this is what happens. These characters will have to do this. That's enough for me to start working, so I'm not going to bother you with that part, and we're just going to go straight to the actual ideation and drawing. Alright, so we're done with this part, which is the outline with just the thumbnails. It may not seem like a lot of information. Actually, let me share my screen. But to me, it is just about enough to get me oriented. You can see I took a photo of what I did. There's a lot of text, so a lot of these bubbles here will be full of text. You see, this is the outline of the entire page. There'll be two long landscape panels, then this big figure here of the girl, and then four smaller panels. And each one I have a letter for: A, B, C, D, E, F, G. So this is F, this is G, this is A, B, C this is the girl, D, E. You see, it's pretty terrible how it looks now, but hopefully that's enough just to get me started on the big page, which is going to be more fun. I'm trying to start from the female figure. You can see that there's some figuring out happening. I change the pose several times and try to commit to whatever looks the best, and whatever size and positioning looks the best. Since this is a page which not only introduces a new character arc, a new arc in the story rather, it also introduces a new character, and the central character here is this female here. So I'm trying to put her front and center, but at the same time add as much information as possible, add as much detail as possible here. Now normally, if you're doing traditional artwork, but even if it's digital, you'd have one artist penciling, one inking, and one coloring.
Since I'm doing all this by myself, I don't have to be this meticulous at every single stage. So what you see here is that I'm just doing the first and second panel in pencil and the figure, and very quickly over here I already switched into inking. I start with the 005 and then I go into the 1 and the Tombow. The reason for that is, I want to streamline the process. If I have to send this artwork to another person to ink, I need to include as much information as possible to transmit my style and my idea to the other person to ink. But if I'm doing it myself, I know what I want to do. So I just add a little bit so I don't forget, especially since this is going over several days. And then I have here the first and second panels done. I go down. Now, when it comes to the inking, the philosophy is I do the outlines and then I do black to white, meaning I start with where the ink is the most, where the shadows are, and I render out into the light. When it comes to the watercolor, it's actually the opposite. Well, it's a good example here. You can see I added the darkest first and then I started render. Sometimes when I'm not sure, I will render and then I'll cover it with black anyways, but I don't want to waste a lot of time. Here I wasted a ton of time on this water surface. I couldn't figure it out. I kept adding and adding detail until I finally was like, you know what, I'll just go black. And if I was confident enough from the start to do that, maybe it would be better. At the end, it's a lot of this is a decision making around like style. You know, because it's a kind of symbolic form, comic book art. You know, you try to convey a lot of information with these symbols, and you figure out how realistic, how stylistic it's gonna be. The lines are very blurry. I try to be very careful with the female faces because more detail there could be detrimental. You want to render them out and be careful, but then all of a sudden it starts looking a little scary. So I try to be just delicate enough so I don't overdo it, and I compensate here on the tree bark by adding as much detail here as I can. But yeah, in general, I try to finish one panel and go to the next. I go left to right and top left corner to right to bottom right corner, so also I don't smudge things, especially when I'm penciling, right? And I mean, there are ways around that. You could put a piece of paper or some device. There's some rulers that people have elevated above the paper, but it's too complicated. So I just do the penciling and I go to inking. And on this panel in particular, I did the inking actually live on my weekly stream, which I do on the same channel. So if you like that, subscribe and check it out. You can see a bit right here. I'm not going to add detail here in the background. It's too far. It's going to take away from these characters. It's going to confuse the eye. But if I repeat this outline better, it's going to be more contrasty for when I start adding the color. So basically, I take you through the process of whatever I'm doing at that point in time. And I explain things. I have a live chat so you can ask questions and I can show you my process or my way of thinking. And then I keep going. There's 2 panels left. I try to also be conscious of the balance of whites and blacks. So I try to look at it overall. Okay, there's a lot of detail here. So on the next one, there's going to be a place for your eyes to rest. You want to be conscious of this because the thing is, you don't want to overtax the reader or the brain of the person that's consuming this by getting bored with all this nuisance of this noise. So you want to have some contrast. You want to leave some spaces white and try to have some sort of a balanced approach to it when it comes to the inking, and the same thing applies to coloring. So you'll see that on the coloring side I do the same thing. I try to leave some paper open, breathing. That's especially important for the watercolor, where that's how you achieve your ultimate highlight. The actual highlight is the paper itself, so you gotta plan for it. And this is it, basically finishing up this final panel. All right, so we're done with the inks at this point.
And this is the final result. And for a page like this is the majority of the work done. And one extra step was scanning this. So let me show you my screen and show you the final result. And you know, it's not perfect because I don't actually scan it. Here's the trick. I just take a photo with my DSLR camera. So here is the actual photo of it. I do it on a, you can probably tell, actually you can see here f/22 aperture, just to have it like as crisp in any point, so I don't have the problem of like, okay, if I focus on her eyeball here, oh, what? Then I don't have this in focus, or I don't have this corner in focus. So just not to have that problem, I go with the maximum aperture on 2.5 seconds exposure in this case, but that depends on your light source. You see my light is not perfect because you can see it blurs out this part. It's shining through here because I'm using this desk lamp that I have pointed in my face at the moment. And the other thing is it is a little too warm, but that's not a problem if you're gonna desaturate it anyway, if it's black and white. So black and white, boom, black and white. And then all I do is I just boost up a little bit of the whites and decrease the blacks just to achieve contrast. That's all. That's basically all of it. I mean, I go through all of these and I cut it, but really it's not that crazy. And if you take a good photo, there's not much to do anyway. I don't do much here. And of course I could, if I go in Photoshop and I, for example, remove this pencil line that I threw by accident, or some of those lines that were harder to erase. There's a lot of things. I mean, you can find some mistake or something, like this eye is a little bit crooked. Oh, I want to fix it. You can fix it later if you want. But at this point, I'm committing to this, and I'm saying that's it. I don't care. It's not going to be perfect because that's what it is. It's art. It's you know, it's funny, goofy, and that's it. And I don't care. All right, so that's it. And now the final part is I have this board here. Is just a normal board. You can use anything. There's nothing special about this board. And I will using a masking tape, I will tape this to the sides. So when I draw with watercolor, the paper, when it buckles, it then finally comes down to you know, as much as possible a even piece of paper, which will make it easier for me to scan it afterwards. In terms of tools, for the previous part, I actually used only these things. So I used just a regular pencil. I'm not even using like any fancy pencils. It's just an HB. I think it's some HB pencil. Some kneaded eraser and a normal eraser. And then for the inks, I use only these three. I have more things, but for this particular page, so I use the 05 micron, I use the 01 micron, and I use the Tombow, or is it Tombow? Yeah, Tombow Fudenosuke. This is the hard tip, but I have the soft tip too. And I have a couple of other things that I occasionally use, like ink, just to splatter or oh yeah, and a whiteout, of course. And this is Posca whiteout to fix some mistakes. The only important thing for me is that it's not about anything fancy or anything. It's just I want ink that it will be water resistant, because I'm going to do watercolors, right? And then the watercolors, I'm going to use this. It's also not at all a fancy setup. It's Sonnet. I think it's a Russian brand of watercolor. You can see it's not a very it's just a basic thing, guys. I'm not buying custom tubes and mixing. When it comes to the watercolor, I am a little more beginner level, I would say, but it's not just that. It's just, you see there's so much ink here. There's not that much space to play around. And the little that I can add with color, I try. In terms of brushes, I have like a big, a medium, and a small one. And that's not even the way you should be differentiating between them, because watercolor artists, they have a lot of like straight brushes, like, you know, I don't know what you call it, like straight brushes, and they have these fat ones and little ones, whatever. The tiniest I have is 2, and that is a little bit too big. The brand doesn't matter, it's just the cheapest, whatever. It's synthetic, you can't, it doesn't focus on it. But it's a number 2, and that's a little bit too big on some of the detail, but also if I go 1, I feel like I'm just gonna go forever. And at this point in the process, I just want to finish this. There's a little bit left, there's the final stretch. We've done most of the work, adding a little bit of color to make things more interesting, and I'll show you the final result.
When it comes to coloring, it's pretty basic. What I do is this. First, I apply what is usually called a flat. So that's the underlining layer of color. You see the yellow for this landscape here, and the blue for the water, and then some kind of a couple of different colors for the sky. And then I start applying color over it. The thing about it is, with watercolor, you got to be careful, because once the color solidifies, it dries. Once you add an additional layer of color, the water that is within that next layer will activate the layer below. And if you move it around too much, you start getting these weird results, and it could get very muddy very quickly. So you got to be careful, and it's easy to add the same color to oversaturate, or to add similar tonal colors. It's much harder when you want to go, I don't know, yellow and then red and then blue, and then these shifts will end up just gray. So watercolor is a lot about planning. It's about like, okay, this is what I want to do. I'll try a few things, but if I fuck up, I fuck up. And so that's why a general good practice here is to start light and add more kind of you know, saturation with time, with each additional layer. And this is what I do here. So basically, once I have the flats, then I go and by adding this first layer, I try to be as light as possible so that I isolate the highlights, and then I can add a little more color and move out from dark to light. The problem is, you know, with watercolor, you gotta wait always for it to dry. You have different effects. If you want to do wet on wet, you can achieve some interesting things. I don't do many crazy things on this particular page. You'll notice that I have a couple of blooms by the bottom, which is basically when you just have a wet spot and it dries in a funny way, and it creates this kind of strange cauliflowers. But mostly I don't have anything weird. Most of this is wet on dry, so it's very simple, it's very basic. It's like using pencils. It's nothing too dramatic, but that's because I have everything so well defined by the inking already. I haven't left this much space for myself to really go crazy and you know, add some incredible effects. On some other pages I experiment with those things. And you know, for that I have other tools. I occasionally use the same tape to mask out some place and then color over it to have some more smooth gradients. Or I also have this masking liquid, but I very rarely use those things really. I prefer to be a little bit more meticulous with the smaller brush and just not waste time and risk ruining the page, which I've done in the past. And it's, you know, really traumatizing. So in here, I'm just coloring. There's a little bit left. By that point, I figured out most of the things. As you can see, I figured out the colors of the specific plants, of the clothing elements. And this is important. So this page would take longer than maybe other pages, because this is the first time we see those characters, the first time we see this environment. And so I would have to, you know, be careful about how I present them and stick to that, and remember the colors also, because, you know, watercolors is about mixing. You got a little bit of red, a little bit of this blue, a little bit of this one, and you end up with a new color. So you got to remember those ratios and how you achieve them to be able to have a consistent result across all the pages. And this is why usually something I do is, I don't do it like that, which is finish the page and immediately start coloring. Also, to keep things interesting for myself, I would ink a succession of pages, like I would ink the entire story arc, and then I would go back and color the entire story arc. So in this case, this is going to be 7 pages centering around this character. And so normally I would just finish the inking of the 7 pages and then start coloring them day after day. And this way I would remember yesterday I colored it like this. So I don't have to worry that I'll forget everything. I don't have to write it down. And yeah, this is the final panel, so basically the final stretch. All right, and we're done. It took me a while. It took me like 5 days. I don't know, 5, 6 more hours a day, but at least I would say 30 hours. But this is the final product. You've seen it already, but that's the page with all the colors. You see, it's saturated enough already. I mean, there's a lot of debate about like watercolor, why it's good or bad, and one of the downsides compared to acrylic or oils is that it's doesn't saturate enough. But you see, if you do, you know, if you apply enough layers, it can get saturated. The reason I'm combining those two, which are not a popular thing to do, usually if you do comic books, you're used to this high contrast ink, black ink versus white paper situation. You would either need to top this, the kind of the high values and the contrast with also very bright colors. So usually if you traditionally would color, you would use acrylics or oils or some hybrid form of coloring. Even gouache would be probably better. But because I like both of those things, I like the inking and I like the colors, and I don't want the two to fight. And the problem is if you use acrylics or other more thick and saturated colors, they will obstruct some of the detail. Some of the finer line work will become invisible, and I don't want to lose that. So I benefit from that translucency of the watercolor and the ink work earlier. So I kind of try to combine the best of both worlds. Usually you wouldn't do that. You would either do watercolor without the inks, with maybe pencils, to kind of have that watercolor feel and this you know, very ethereal light structure to allow the shapes and the patterns of the watercolor, the water drying on the paper, to create edges for your different, you know, design elements. Or you would do inks and then a different kind of color. But I do this instead, and I think it's cool. And because the watercolor has its own benefits, and because it's easy and you know, relatively affordable, not too messy. That's why I'm combining those two. Actually, let me show you how it looks. Here we go. You can see a little bit of extra sharpening here and there, but that's it. I haven't done anything else but just general Lightroom adjustments overall on the entire image. Nothing special. Haven't fixed anything in Photoshop. It is what it is. It's the way you saw me draw it, and this is the final result. You saw I added some splashes at the very end, so some white out here for some highlights. But overall, it was just step by step, one after the other, until this final result. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. If you like this sort of content, stick around, make sure to subscribe, and let me know what you think in the comments. Thank you.